Well, thank you. I think we're going to start with
when I was editor of Time, we made Vladimir Putin Person of the Year in 2007, and he agreed to an interview. We went to Moscow. From Moscow, we drove out to his dacha outside of Moscow for an interview, and it was meant to be for lunch. He kept us waiting for 6 hours, so it turned into dinner. It was in that interview that he famously said that the greatest tragedy of the 20th century was the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And after the initial interview, we had this great British photographer named Platon going to take his picture. And Platon is this kind of elfin fellow, and while he's taking the picture, his shtick is that he talks about the Beatles, and just before he takes the picture, he asks the person, "What's your favorite Beatles song?" Putin had not said a word of English during the whole interview, and when Platon turned to Putin and said, "What's your favorite Beatles song?" without missing a beat, he said, "Yesterday."
So as Alex said, I started a podcast in association with DLD, which was called How to Fix Democracy. This book is a compilation of some of the best interviews. We've got about 14 interviews. And the reason why we entitled this book Tomorrow's versus Yesterday's is because having had these excellent conversations, as Alex said, Peter Sunday, who's in a session later, Maria, who's coming up, Rana Faruha, many others, David Kirkpatrick, Scott Galloway, I discovered that there was a kind of, that the best way to describe the future, or the opportunities in the future, is in terms of democracy, are the tomorrows versus yesterdays. Putin, in particular, is pioneering a kind of high-tech, disinformational dystopia in Russia, built around many of the principles we're all very familiar with, fetishizing the past. And what we're seeing, I think, throughout the world in the early part of the 20th century is the growth of this kind of new digital neo-authoritarianism. It's not so much the China model, it's the model pioneered, as I said, by Putin, by the AfD in Germany, by Erdogan, by Bolsonaro, by Duterte, which Maria will talk about in a couple of seconds. A model of democracy, a model of populism built around disinformation, built around the destruction of the idea of truth. We thought that the internet, when it was born over the last 30 or 40 years, we thought that all this information would create democracy, would create wisdom, would create freedom. The problem, this is the great nightmare I think we're seeing unfold in real time over the last 10 to 15 years, is that the more digital successfully becomes, the more neo-authoritarianism grows. So the premise of the internet was everyone would be free. We'd have the Arab Spring, we'd have Occupy, we'd have all these movements that threw off the shackles of authoritarianism. The reverse is true. It's also true, of course, in corporate policy. Just as we have the growth of Putinism and this new disinformation strategy of neo-authoritarianism, we have the rise of these trillion-dollar global superpowers like Apple, like Google, like Amazon. Roger McNamee will be here to talk about the problems with Facebook. We're all very familiar with these problems. So the challenge in this book, and the challenge for all of us, is not to fall into that nostalgia trap. The challenge is not to fetishize a pre-digital past. That would be too easy for us, to go back to some analog ideal. That's why I mentioned the citizens' assemblies. The citizen assembly experiment, which is now being pioneered in Ireland and throughout Europe, is using the Greek idea of a political lottery in a modern way. So our challenge is building on the past. Our challenge is innovation, but doing so in the context of this new world of neo-authoritarianism. a neo-authoritarianism that's being stoked by the problems of globalization, by the internet, by the cultural insecurities of the early part of the 21st century. So this book is a beginning. It fits in to what Steffi said in the introduction to the event. What are you adding? Every one of these people in this book are adding something, whether it's Martin Wolf, the FT economics correspondent, whether it's Rana Faruha, David Kirkpatrick, we're all adding something. But if there's one person in this book who's adding the most, it's my friend Maria Ressa, who's up next. Maria Ressa is adding a huge amount. She single-handedly seems to be taking on the neo-authoritarian Philippines government. We're beginning to recognize it. Of course, Maria was, in a much better way than Putin, Maria was Time Magazine's Person of the Year in 2018. So it's a real honor and a pleasure to introduce Maria. But before she comes up, I have a very brief video. I'm also making a film called How to Fix Democracy. And as always with Maria, she's the star. And I think this clip summarizes what Maria is doing. So when you think about what are you adding, think about Maria. Not all of us can be not all of us can be Maria, but we can use her life, her struggle, her bravery as inspiration.